So next up we have Amy, who is going to talk about COVID-19 and how that has affected our university students and how we experience university. Hi Amy.
Hi.
If you want to share your screen.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, so hi. I thought I'd start with a few questions. So this is just for everyone. If you're a student or not a student, feel free to answer. But do you feel like you belong to your university, and has COVID-19 changed this? Feel free to type your answers in the chat. And if you're not a student, think back to when you were at last a student. Do you felt like you belonged there? You belonged in the education system? And do you think that if you'd experienced that during COVID, it would have changed? So these were the questions that I asked. So my name's Amy Paul. I'm a fourth year psychology and maths student, and my dissertation was into how sense of belonging and COVID-19 concern impacted student mental health. I'll start by giving an overview of the literature and what's already out there, then move into what I've done, what I found, and why it is important. So why is mental health research so important? Well, in 2020, a report came out that claimed that over a third of UK undergrad students had experienced a decline in their mental well-being since starting university. In the same report, they claimed that universities in the UK just don't have a working definition of mental health, which means that they don't have the adequate support system for this number of students that really need it. And it's important to note it's all done in 2020, before the lockdown, before the pandemic. Ever since that first lockdown, more and more studies are coming out that suggest the number of students who are seeking support and have a worsened mental state is just rising. So what does the literature say? If you look at this chart here, you'll see how it's all connected. I just mentioned how COVID-19 impacts student mental health, with it leading to a decline in student mental health. But student belonging is also something that impacts student mental health. Students who feel like they belong more to the university, like they're more at home there and more comfortable, are less likely to experience a bad mental health during their time at university. And COVID-19 also impacts student mental health. So we have two things that impact it. But COVID-19 and student belonging are also related. COVID-19 led to a change in the student experience as we all know it. And research is now coming out saying that because of this change, such as online lectures and just the general disruption, students felt less and less that they belonged to their university. So we have three variables here all interlinked, but there was no studies looking at all three of these together. And that's what my research was. So I did an online questionnaire which measured all three of these. I looked into COVID-19 concern. This is just how worried someone feels about contracting coronavirus or spreading it or getting seriously ill. I also looked at sense of belonging. Within sense of belonging, there were four factors I looked at. Perceived isolation, so how alone and lonely a student feels. Perceived faculty support. This is how much they feel like they can rely on the members of staff of the university to help them. Perceived classroom comfort, which is just how comfortable they were within the classroom setting itself. And perceived peer support, which is about their classmates and how much they felt like they got on with them and could rely on them. I also looked at mental health, and there were three different parts of mental health I looked at: anxiety, depression, and stress. So this survey was given to 260 undergrad students around the UK from the middle of November to the end of January this year. You'll see on this slide a couple of the questions I asked. Students were just asked to indicate how much they agreed or disagreed with these statements. So I've met with classmates outside of class or study for an exam. How true is that of them? And then you had the next question: to what extent are you concerned about COVID-19? So that was a COVID worry one, where they indicated how worried they were. And the final two are looking at the mental health factors. It's important to note, though, when I'm talking about mental health, I'm not talking about clinical definitions. I'm just talking about the negative emotional states of anxiety, depression, and stress. As far as I know, I could not tell you if anyone in my study had a clinical diagnosis of any of these conditions. And instead, we're just looking at how they felt over a short 2-week period in terms of their emotions. This means that there is no actual clinical diagnosis within the study, and I'm not trying to diagnose anyone, which is very important. So what did I find? Well, I found moderate depression, moderate stress, and severe anxiety. So ideally, you want to find a normal level of depression, anxiety, and stress. This just means there's very little of these in the student population, and they're just not feeling down or anxious or stressed at all. But as you get more and more people reporting it, the average got higher and higher. So the moderate levels of depression and stress suggest there's alleviated levels of depression and stress in the student population, not so much that you'd want to be majorly concerned, but enough to warrant you to look at it again and think about why this may be. Now, anxiety levels were severe. This was even higher. This suggests that students are much more anxious than the general population, and it is something we should be a bit concerned about. So let's look at depression and anxiety in a bit more detail. So for depression, I found that perceived isolation was the only factor which predicted depression. What this means is students who felt like they were isolated, like they had no one to talk to, no one to rely on, were more likely to have those severe depression scores. I didn't find that COVID-19 concern related to depression at all. However, we all know that COVID-19 did lead to isolation for a lot of people, and perceived isolation increased during that period. So it could be linked in this way. Now, for anxiety, I also found perceived isolation predicted it, but I found a bit more. COVID-19 concern, perceived classroom comfort, and perceived isolation all predicted anxiety. This means students with higher COVID worry or lower classroom comfort and higher isolation were each more likely to have severe anxiety. But these are students who were very worried about contracting the virus, who felt very alone and just didn't feel comfortable engaging in lectures anymore. But what does this all actually mean? Well, it's really important to consider this in terms of interventions. Whilst it's good to know that sense of belonging and COVID-19 impacts student mental health, we now need to think about how we can use this. And there's many different ways this can be used. The major one for this is student support. I mentioned earlier that universities just don't have an adequate mental health support for students. This is mostly due to a lack of funding and a lack of available resources for the massive increase of students now reaching out, and not a fault of the university itself. So if we can find a way to alleviate the number of students that are coming forward and needing this, by maybe reducing their depression, anxiety, and stress scores before they have to reach out, we can do this by making sure they don't feel isolated, making sure they feel much more comfortable in the lecture setting, and trying to find ways to alleviate that worry over contracting COVID. It's also important for classroom support. Perceived classroom comfort being a predictor of anxiety was not something I expected, but it's really important. What this suggests is we should actually be looking at the lectures themselves and tutorials to find ways to make the students feel much more at home and more comfortable, whether it's an online lecture or in person, finding ways for them to talk to the lecturers either through apps or breakout rooms or anything such as that, so they do feel like they're engaged in the lecture and they're part of it. This could be really important at alleviating anxiety symptomology in the students. It's also important for challenges of the future. I don't think coronavirus is going to be a one-off event. It's very likely that we will see the student experience disrupted again at another point, maybe a pandemic, maybe some other sort of event. And chances are that when there's a disruption in student learning like this, there'll also be a disruption in student mental health. So we can take what we've just found and find ways to make sure we increase students' sense of belonging during periods like this and reduce their worries about the external world, just to try and decrease this mental health decline and prevent it from getting so bad that they do need support. So who may this help the most? Well, this was done on the general student population. As such, it is going to help the general student population the most. They're the ones that the interventions would really work for. However, we can also apply this to the clinical population. Students with a clinical diagnosis are still students. And if we can find a way to slightly reduce their anxiety, depression, and stress symptomology, this could majorly change their lives and help them out a lot. In particular, I'm thinking of students from minority backgrounds, such as racial, ethnic, or sexual minorities. These students often report that they are less and less likely to feel like they belong to their university. But these are also the same students who are more and more likely going to report declined mental health. So these are the ones that really are at risk, and they're the ones who'd benefit the most from some sort of intervention to help students. But we can apply this to anyone and everyone. Think back to the questions I asked at the start. Everyone has a sense of community and belonging to something. This could be work, this could be religious, it could be even where you live. We all are part of a community, and we've all experienced coronavirus. All of us have gone through that period of time where we just felt alone and we were locked in our houses. So this really does work for everyone and apply to everyone. The general population's mental health is also in decline because of the pandemic, and as such, we need to find ways to intervene and help them as well. So I want to put this all into perspective. Most higher education facilities do not have a working definition of mental health, and they just don't have adequate student support to help students who are reaching out to them and need it. But sense of belonging and COVID-19 concern both impact student mental health. So these are the two areas that we could target with interventions to try and reduce the strain and make sure that they are okay. Now, it's important to note this was done during the Omicron wave. This wave was unlike the ones we've seen before. We never went into lockdown, and we had measures such as boosters and masks and social distancing already put in place that just meant we could continue life as normal. As we move out of the pandemic and learn how to live with coronavirus, we can apply these findings even more. It's likely that other waves will come, but it's also likely that we won't go into lockdowns or as severe measures. So these findings really do represent our lives now as we try and live with the virus. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Amy. Well done. And you can see at the bottom there, everyone's showing their appreciation for your talk with their applause. So you've got a couple of questions in the chat, if you don't mind answering those. The first one, can you talk a bit more about how belonging can be achieved during a pandemic or other events like this? Did the students tell you what helped them to feel that they belong?
So belonging in general is just a feeling that you feel like you're part of your community. And as such, the students didn't tell me how I felt like I belonged, but it very much was the feelings of isolation, that they're not engaging with their classmates during it. They're not having that one-to-one time. They're not getting a coffee after a lecture. They're not having a chat before it. And these are really the areas that have been changed during the pandemic. They're the things we miss out on that we don't kind of realize we miss out on from not being in person and having to, not loiter and social distance and wear masks. So it could help during the pandemic to just put in place more coffee events from home over Zoom or other things like that, where you just encourage people to speak to one another from the safety of your home, of course, and just try and achieve more of those little things that we really missed out on in the first place.
Sure. And your second question, where would you recommend universities to look for a working definition of mental health?
So probably within the literature to begin with, obviously, but I think it's important to reach out to the students and find what they think is mental health, what's mental well-being, just trying to hear from them, because they're the ones you really want to help with this. So they're the ones that you do want to reach out to and you do want to hear from. And you can use that to actually define what their students think mental health is and where they need to target.
Yeah, absolutely right. Thank you so much. If you can just join me in congratulating Amy one last time. Thank you so much for your talk. That was super, super interesting, and obviously still very, very relevant for where we are today.